Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Mark Saxon, the St. Louis Cardinals reporter for The Athletic. In this episode, I chat with Mark about his baseball media career, covering baseball on the West Coast, his approach to covering the sport nationally, his transition to The Athletic, as well as the challenges of covering this bizarre 2020 season. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. Now let's get to episode 63 with Mark Saxon on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Mark Saxon. He is a senior writer at The Athletic who covers the St. Louis Cardinals. Mark, thanks so much for joining me on the pod today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I really appreciate you reaching out from across the border and up there in Toronto and everything. So I'm looking forward to providing whatever information and insights that I can, Lucas.
Well, absolutely. And, we'll get into a bit of your career path in a moment, but obviously the big news of the day is baseball is going on a path to starting its season here in 2020. Teams are supposed to be reporting to spring training July 1st. So I'm just curious for you, what you sort of think of this, plan to start the season after what was a very tumultuous negotiation between the MLB and MLBPA.
Yeah, I think you used a good term. It's a path. They have a path to restarting this season. To me, there are like 100 things that could derail it. And we have to be realistic about that because we are seeing cases going up in a lot of U.S. states, particularly certain cities. Houston is a mess right now from everything I see. Florida is a mess right now. Arizona is a mess right now. These are places that have several teams. So we're going to see how it goes. But, I do think there's a genuine excitement of getting guys back out there and people being able to watch something on TV in the evening. And I think potentially the competition could be really cool. So it's just kind of stage by stage. Let's see how it's going. But I think a lot of people are happy that there's at least a movement toward baseball now.
And Mark, for you, baseball coverage, it's normally a long season, 162 games. You get to go to a bunch of different ballparks and talk to a lot of different people. But now it's 60 games, and there's, from what my assumption is, going to be a lot of virtual conference calls. So what's that challenge going to be like for you as a reporter used to a completely different way of reporting on baseball and having to change it overnight?
Yeah, I think it'll be significant. I think, just the act of having a conversation, Lucas, if you and I were at a coffee shop or in your living room sitting down to have this conversation, we'd have more information, right? We'd be conversing in a little bit better way. We're making do with these Zoom calls now, and that looks like that's what interviews are going to be like, at least for the short term or the medium term. When will they get back to in-person interviews? I don't know, but it's a significant blow, particularly, I think, for people like myself who work at The Athletic, where it's a subscription site. And so the notion is to have something different from maybe the other reporters in a market, something that can only be gotten through one-on-one interviews. So we'll see how accommodating teams are in terms of setting up those one-on-ones. But definitely for me right now, there's some anxiety. There's some worry about whether I can do my job as I think I need to do it.
Well, especially when the job relies on, going in the clubhouse and having those in-person conversations and getting those little nuggets and tidbits that make you stand out as a reporter. And now that that's, blocked due to the pandemic, it just makes it a lot more challenging. So, but I guess for you, having, what have these, few months been like for you, just trying to come up with new ways to create content?
It's kind of been fun on a certain level because it's tested me, and I think it's tested probably yourself and others who are kind of doing this for, doing, covering this sports world, because suddenly there's no content, right? All the guys are sent back home to their living rooms, just like you and I are sitting in our dens or our living rooms or our bedrooms or our apartments and doing our, so there was no content. And so we had to get creative, right? And I did a story, believe it or not, on my 89-year-old uncle's autograph collection and how he has Joe DiMaggio and Kennesaw Mountain Landis and all these really kind of early 20th century baseball stars in his autograph book, because he used to be a season ticket holder at Sportsman's Park here in St. Louis. And so that was an example of kind of an outside the box story I wouldn't have been able to do. Some of it is nostalgia, talking about former Cardinals teams or other franchises. And so you had to get a little creative. Sometimes you weren't doing reporting so much as research, right? And finding fun lists for people and things. So I think it was a time like where hardcore sports fans were still looking for content. And so we had to provide it. And I think again, on the creativity level, it was good for some of us.
Shifting gears now and talking about your career, and in doing research for this interview, I noticed that, you started your baseball writing career in 1998, and what a year that was for baseball, known as the summer of 98, and, long gone summer. The ESPN documentary recently came out. And of course you were covering, Barry Bonds and the San Francisco Giants for the Oakland Tribune. So I'm just curious, like, to start your career in that summer must have just been an excitement thrill ride for a writer like yourself, being able to, come up with stories on, so much excitement happening in the sport.
Yeah, first of all, great research on your part, because I consider myself kind of an obscure media figure, and you dug that up. So kudos to you. So as you mentioned, I was on the West Coast covering baseball for the first almost about 25 years of my career, but I'm actually from St. Louis. And so it was fun. Again, I was covering the Giants at that time, living in the Bay Area, but it was fun to see kind of the baseball world revolve around the Midwest. It quickly became the Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa home run chase, and that was fun for me to see. And I will tell you this, even though I covered a different team, if you were in the National League or, you came across Mark McGwire or Sammy Sosa that year, you were doing stories on them, because it was that big. It didn't matter what team you were covering. Everybody wanted any kind of content on those two guys. I think some people have forgotten that now, because we tend to see it through the prism of, was it all meaningless because of the PEDs? At the time, nobody was saying that. It was the biggest deal in the world. And I can tell you some of my earliest memories just of being around the game are standing behind the batting cage and watching Mark McGwire take batting practice. I've never seen anything like it in the game, just in terms of how far he was hitting balls, how consistently he was hitting them a mile. It was really something to see. He was just a larger-than-life kind of persona then.
Well, and for me, Mark, I'm always, a little bit conflicted. And of course, I just recently watched the documentary, because obviously, part of their legacy is the PEDs, but at the same time, you look at where baseball was in 1998, coming after the strike in 94, and this was just a huge way to inject excitement into the game that hadn't been seen before. So I think, on one hand, you look back and there's this, debate about whether it's actually credible, but for a time, it certainly got a lot of young people into the game, something that baseball right at the, at this current moment is struggling to do.
Yeah, that's right. And, God forbid we could be seeing a situation if, for example, this season ends up getting canceled again. If after 2021, if there's another labor dispute, you could see a similar type of thing happen again, because we all know that baseball doesn't have quite the same traction as the NBA or the NFL do. Where you are, I'm sure the NHL. It doesn't have the same pace as those sports, right? And so it's always a little bit of a struggle for baseball in this rapid fire kind of society we live in to capture as large a percentage as it would for those other sports. And you could see a crisis in the game. And, I think traditionally this game has kind of rescued itself from itself. Something great comes along on the field and everybody gets captivated again. There have been other scandals before, way back to 100 years ago, the Black Sox scandal, right? That created serious problems for the game. People didn't know if they could trust it. There have been people who cheated throughout the history of the game, whether it was spitballers, people scuffing the ball on the pitching side, whether it was something as ridiculous as the color barrier, where for 60 years black players couldn't play. So was Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio, were they playing against the best players in the world? I don't know. The 1928 Yankees never played the 1928 St. Louis Stars, so we'll never know. But I do think you have to judge those players from the PED era among themselves. And every era of baseball is a little bit different, and we have to be cognizant of that.
You mentioned how you grew up in St. Louis, and then you, of course, start your baseball career on the West Coast. Was it intimidating for you, Mark, to start your career in such a big market like the Bay Area?
It didn't feel like it at the time because I was, I went to graduate school at Berkeley. I went to journalism school at Cal Berkeley. And for me, I was just so hungry to cover major sporting events that I wasn't really pausing to think, how intimidating it was. It was a little different then in that you didn't see as many young people, with credentials back then. So I do remember at 28, when I got my first beat, I got onto the Giants beat, and these were all, 39 to 60-year-old men who'd been doing it a long time. That part was a little bit intimidating, and I learned a lot from the competition of it. And that's kind of how it traditionally worked, right? You would cover high schools, then maybe small colleges, then you might cover a major university sport, or whether it's football or basketball, and then eventually you get a pro beat. But now with things like MLB.com, blogs, other things, you're seeing a lot more access points, and I think that's great because we're drawing from a larger talent pool, and I think that's where you're ultimately trying to get.
And of course, for you then, after, the Oakland Tribune, you work at, the OC Register and then ESPN.com. And I'm just curious, at these different stops along the way, how your baseball coverage has evolved.
That's good. That's a really good question. I think I can tell you this. When I went to the Orange County Register, I was hired to cover the Angels. And that was like the number one beat at that newspaper in their sports department at that time, along with the Ducks. They have two teams in Orange County, the Angels and the Ducks. But I remember going in and thinking, the LA Times has all these heavy duty, big name sports reporters. I'm not going to be intimidated by that. I've been doing it up in Oakland. I wasn't as well known, but I'm going to try to, provide the same tough, the same really, the same hardworking coverage that those people are providing. And that was my attitude going in. And at times probably I maybe was a little too hard on the team, maybe because I was trying to show that I was like a big city reporter. And so I gradually learned to sort of temper that a little bit. You have to be fair to the people you're covering. And then ESPN, that was just a lot of fun because if you'll recall at the time, ESPN was starting all these city sports websites, and we were part of ESPN LA. It was just kind of fun to be part of a new thing, right? Like we were kind of reinventing it, and we all worked ridiculous hours. It's funny, you're in Toronto. I remember one day I was covering the Angels at the time. I flew all the way back from Toronto. I caught a 6 a.m. flight, Toronto to LAX. And I remember I had to cover that night's game in Orange County that day. So it was like a 17-hour day. We all worked a ton of hours, but it was fun because we were starting something new. And we all it was a labor of love for all of us. So that was a lot of fun. And then The Athletic has been interesting because it's subscription-based. That's new. You're always sort of looking for that thing that's going to grab a lot of interest, a lot of that people are just dying to get that content, so they're willing to subscribe for it. And that's been another lesson for me. So the whole thing, I've really been kind of lucky, and I don't know why I've had this kind of luck, but I have.
Well, a lot of journalists need some luck along the way. I mean, for sure, you go, I mean, you say, wow, you know how to write, you're talented, all this, but like, you can't underestimate the power of luck, being at the right place at the right time. Because I feel like, in an industry that's, ever changing and evolving, you need that little bit of luck. But I always think that like the best people will always find the opportunities. And I just think that, even, it's a long journey, a journalism career. So, it's interesting to see the different stops along the way.
Right. And, if I were to give one piece of advice to a young person try to get it, persevere, because you're going to have people tell you no 50 times to your face, and it doesn't feel good at the time. But if you think you can do it, if you believe in your writing ability, if you believe in your ability to go get answers and your reporting ability, keep going. If it's what you love, keep going. Just, you'll find an outlet to do what you want to do if you're intent on it, I think.
You mentioned that you covered the Angels. Do you have any good Vladimir Guerrero stories? I know that his son is currently in Toronto right now, but do you have any good stories that are worth sharing?
Very distinct. First of all, I was able to visit Vlad Guerrero Sr. in the Dominican Republic, and that was something I'll never forget. That was really a lot of fun. He's a very quiet man. I don't know what his son is like, because the last time I saw him, he was about 7 years old. And I do distinctly recall Vlad Jr. at 5 years old. He still had a pacifier on a head, I swear to God. And he would imitate other Angels' batting stances, especially his dad's, of course, right? Yeah. And he was 5 years old, and I do remember his dad would toss him balls, and he was ripping them into left field. Like, I got kids, and they're both good ball players. At 5 years old, they couldn't hit the ball to the shortstop. This kid was really, you could see it, just had a different set of genes, right? And his dad was just something else to watch. I mean, you're talking about, I think, one of the most talented baseball players that's ever lived, and the kid obviously got those genes.
No doubt. I mean, Vlad Jr., I know we love him in Toronto, and like, while he may have not had like the best rookie season ever, like at the same time, like there were so many expectations put on him given how well he was doing in AAA and just the natural power from his swing. So I feel like some of the expectations from not just Toronto, but like baseball in general were just a bit unfair. But like, he's someone that I think is going to have a great career if he just continues, on the path to success.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that's one of the perils right now, because there's so much attention given to minor league prospects that didn't used to be the case, when his dad was coming up. I mean, there's so many stories from his dad's career of going to a tryout for the Dodgers and not having spikes. So he had to borrow his cousins, and they were 3 sizes too large, and so he didn't show his speed, all sorts of stuff like that. But of course, Vlad Jr. grew up in relative affluence, and so he had, access to things that his father didn't have. And I think that's another part of the story as well. Baseball can be kind of an expensive sport, and that's one of the things when you look at who's playing it. That's one of the limiting factors, and it's kind of unfair in a way to young players.
And you mentioned, Mark, how you transition over to the Athletic, and you're now covering the St. Louis Cardinals. And my question is just, because you've spent so long on the West Coast covering teams, now you come to cover the Cardinals. Was it a bit of a challenge at first to stand out from the beat and writers that have been there for much longer than you have? Or did you think that your experience covering baseball already prepared you for this new challenge?
I always took it as the latter for the most part. But there was definitely a lack of institutional knowledge initially when compared to some of the people who had worked in this market. I think what helped me is that my whole childhood was here, and I I was a big fan as a kid. So those 80s teams, 1982, 85, 87, they were in the World Series 3 times between when I was 10 and 20. So I did know about Cardinals history up to that point. But as I moved to the West Coast and I was involved with other things, covering other sports, eventually covering other teams, as you mentioned, I did sort of lose track, especially when I was covering the American League, of what was going on with the Cardinals. So that did take some time to get to know how their system works, their organization, who you can talk to get information from, but also just the way the fan base thinks. Because if you think about a Dodgers fan versus a Cardinals fan, very different parts of the country, different sociologies, different. So that was a little bit different adjusting to that. And I've seen cases where, the fan base has just reacted very differently to the types of stories I was writing.
Can you maybe dive into that? Like, just, describe how the different fan bases would react? Like, would you say that the Cardinals are a lot more, passionate? I mean, like, both are passionate, but like just react more compared to Dodgers fans, or vice versa?
Well, one of the things that's different, just extremely different, and one is not better than the other, but just sociologically, politically, very different kinds of parts of the country. So if, for example, like with some of the health stuff that's going on now, amazingly in our country, that has somehow become a political issue, whether you should wear a mask or you shouldn't wear a mask. So what I would say is the types of, and a lot of this is just sort of me reading between the lines, the reactions on Twitter or something like that. And I do think social media can be a little bit distracting and take you away from, what most people are thinking, because it's a small minority of people who are very vocal with their opinions. But just in terms of that type of stuff, the reactions have been different. But also, I think because the Cardinals for many years were the furthest west and the furthest south of any team in Major League Baseball for like 60 years. Mm-hmm. You do have a culture here that is very Cardinals oriented versus MLB oriented. So you do find, I think, that people here will reference something, compare something to something that happened in Cardinals history, and not necessarily to something that happened with another major league team. So I have noticed that. I guess the pejorative word would be a little more provincial here. But I think another way of looking at it is just a very passionate local regional fan base that you have here. And that's really throughout the Deep South, a lot of the, near Western states, Oklahoma, Colorado. So you do have a lot. It's a very strong regional fan base, the Cardinals.
And you hit the nail on the head with, just passionate and regional. And I think, like, anytime you see the Cardinals make a run in the playoffs, whether it was the 2011 World Series win, and, even last year when they made the NLCS, like, just passionate. Like, you can see it, on the TV screen at Busch Stadium. It's one of the best ballparks in the big leagues. But Mark, I want to end by just, maybe asking you a question about, just writing on baseball, especially, as it gets back up again, because, look, I mean, like, there are young writers more now, as you mentioned earlier, out there covering big league teams compared to when you first started out in the business. So I'm just curious if you have any advice for a young writer who's, who gets this big opportunity to cover a big beat, but recognizes, wow, like, it's a 162 game grind in normal times, and you got to, figure out real unique ways to, keep yourself fresh and stand out from the pack.
I would say two things. The part about the 162 game grind, there's nothing I can say that would prepare someone for that. We were talking, about when I started 1,000 years ago. And I remember the first month on the beat, I got sick like 3 times because I was getting on airplane flights so often. And I just wasn't prepared for the rigors of having to go to work every day from 2:30 till 12:30 at night. And it did grind after a while. But you do really get it in your skin. It gets in your blood, and it's really hard to kind of leave the scene. It's a fun thing to be around. And in terms of what I would advise young writers to do, it's always push the envelope. These teams are so good now at spinning their own narratives, right? And making it seem as if everything's always great, and we're doing things in the best interest of our fan base. It's not always the case. These are corporations like any other corporations, big businesses. Push the envelope. Always have one more conversation. Don't just take people, because they say this is the way it's happening. If you think it's not happening that way and you have an inkling, go talk to some other people who might be able to tell you what's really going on. Always try to find the story beneath the story, because they're not always that apparent. And when you do that, that's going to naturally make you stand out. You're going to have stuff that's different. And I think people will gravitate to that if it feels authentic and real. That's going to make you stand out. And so I would say, do that and do it in your own voice. Be confident with what you have to say about it and what you're finding out. Trust your sources and just go for it. That would be my best advice that I could come up with.
Some great advice. Mark Saxon, he's a senior MLB writer at The Athletic. He covers the St. Louis Cardinals. Make sure to check out his content on that outlet. Mark, thanks so much for joining me on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles today, and all the best for the 2020 season. Hopefully it starts and finishes as scheduled.
Lucas, it was a really enjoyable conversation, very thoughtful questions, and I appreciate you having me on. Thanks so much, and good luck to you.